it's always hard having a session right after lunch because everyone's a bit, sluggish and, but let's just look at our neighbors and say we're going to have a great time. Come on.
Great time.
We are. That's true.
Have a great time.
Now, I'm really grateful to be here for very many reasons. But before we start, let me just give you a brief introduction about myself. My name is Myra Anubi, and I'm a storyteller. As you've been told, I am the presenter for the podcast program People Fixing the World from the BBC World Service that looks at just solutions. So I wake up every day, I hear about problems, and I spend my day finding out about solutions. So this is really exciting for me. And it's also a reminder that each one of us can be part of the solution in our own way. And I could speak about that for the rest of this session, but I won't. But also, I came to the UK probably 4 years ago now, almost 5. And I've lived in Kenya, and I've seen some of the problems that we have heard on this stage. But while I was there, I met a man who promised me good weather. I believed him, and I ended up here. But, it's about discussing these changes in different facets and seeing what's working, what's not. Now, today, we are here to talk about green money. And for the longest time, the color green was always associated with money. But when we talk about green money, it means something completely different in 2024, right? And it has the potential to help billions of people around the world. But what does green money mean? And is it actually making an impact? And when we have to tell our audiences, the people that we write these stories for, how do we explain what's happening in this industry? That, my friends, is why we have these amazing people on the stage. Now, I notice they've come with notes, so they are ready. They're ready to share lots of stuff. I'm going to start by introducing them. I'm going to start with Kenneth here, Kenneth Cole. Kenneth leads Mercy Corp Venture Lab, designing first-of-a-kind initiatives for underserved users in emerging markets to increase financial and climate resilience. The Venture Lab's vehicle includes AI for climate resilience, the Climate Tech Facility, and the Crypto for Good Fund. We've actually been talking about crypto and green money, which he will explain a bit later on, which includes both humanitarian and economic empowerment use cases. He has a background in impact investing, startups, international development, and management consulting, having spent the past decade across Southeast Asia, Africa, and even my home country, Kenya. Round of applause. And then we'll move over to Rob Soutar. Rob is an award-winning writer, editor with more than 10 years experience specializing in climate, environment, development, change, and focusing mainly on Latin America. Now, since July 2022, he's been the environment editor at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, a UK non-profit organization, right? Newsroom.
Yeah.
And here he has run award-winning investigations into fossil fuel finance and the climate and indigenous rights impacts of the Brazilian livestock industry. His work has also appeared in different publications across the world, in the UK, of course, France, Brazil, Colombia, and the US. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
And then we have Alex Popescu. Alex is a writer, editor, with more than 15 years experience in environmental and science journalism. Now, prior to joining Mongabay as Latin America editor for the Global News Desk, she worked with National Geographic magazine and Euronews and several international development organizations focused on environmental issues in Latin America. Alexander has a master's in science in environmental change and management from the University of Oxford, and master's in arts, Masters of Arts in International Journalism from City University London. Let's welcome Alex. And finally, we have Debbie Hillier. Debbie is her current role is head of the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance program for Mercy Corps, and has two elements, right? First, leading Mercy Corps' program in Indonesia, Jordan, Nepal, that measure and strengthen resilience at community level and use this evidence to achieve policy and practice change at provincial, national and national level. Second, leading influencing for the whole alliance. It's 9 organizations in total to achieve global policy change that will strengthen adaptation, including issues such as climate finance, loss, damage, and disaster recovery. And before this, Debbie worked at Oxford Policy Management, leading on DRF evaluations and a cross-country research program on shock response social systems. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I think the first thing is to understand what exactly is green money. How would you each define that? Maybe I'll start with you.
I think it's a very broad term. So for us, like just to give everyone a background, like Mercy Corps Ventures, like Mercy Corps, as you may know, it's like an NGO. That's one of the partners here. We are the impact investment arm of Mercy Corps. So like, think of like Shark Tank or Dragon's Den, but like rather than like a bunch of like bald old white dudes sitting around, it's like slightly more diverse and more focused on like emerging market use cases that are impactful. So like we screen and evaluate startups that we think will have the ability to increase climate resilience, financial inclusion in emerging markets, which we define as Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So within our portfolio, we invest exclusively across those geographies and within those focus areas. We have a portfolio of 55 startups. 44% of them are female founded, which is orders of magnitude higher than industry standard and what you would expect from typical venture capital investing. And we every investment that we make follows our climate and adaptation resilience framework. So it's determining, how does this investment help someone prepare for the effects of climate change, adapt to it, and then recover if a climate disaster does strike. So that's how we think about the deployment of capital for green purposes.
Okay. What about you, Rob?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And just a small disclaimer before I go ahead is I'm not that we have an absolute expert green finance reporter on the environment team at TBIJ who couldn't make it today, but I'm deputising for her. But we have run some investigations together, investigations that I've overseen into fossil fuel finance. So I think when we're talking about green finance, what is green finance? We need to also understand what it's not. I mean, broadly speaking, green finance is finance that is trying to help achieve environmental goals, right? Very broadly speaking. But sort of within that, you have a range of financial products that are out there on the market. That's in financial markets. There's also the sort of public finance. We don't look too much into that. We look at sort of high street banks, so-called green finance. And look, we're not, what our role is really is to kind of probe how green the green finance products are. And one of the kind of distinctions that we need to make when we're talking about green finance is you can talk about things like green loans and green bonds, which is finance for specific projects, like be it a solar farm or some other project that is designed to lower emissions or make a community more resilient to climate change, those kind of things. And then there's this other kind of world of sustainability linked finance, which we've sort of looked at. There are big question marks about how green that really is. So we looked into products like sustainability linked loans and sustainability linked bonds, and I'll explain what they are. That's finance in exchange for a company making emissions reductions commitments. So they'll get finance at a lower rate of interest if they say, we'll cut emissions intensity per every ton of cement we produce by this amount by a certain date. The issue with that is it's often kind of corporate level finance. So it's finance for the cement company, or it can even be for a fossil fuel company. And it's not necessarily for a project that will achieve those goals. So, we found examples of, an Indian cement company that emits more than Greece, raising hundreds of millions of pounds in bond markets in exchange for a commitment that would cost it basically nothing if it didn't meet it. So sustainability-linked loans and bonds are a kind of incentive to green transition your business, but there's no strong disincentive.
So it's basically we have to understand what green money or green finance also isn't, or the
exactly. What is it and what isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's kind of our job at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism is we look at fossil fuel finance, a lot of which is raised by these so-called sustainable finance products. So we're probing how green they really are. That's part of our job.
Nice. Alex?
Well, I think a lot of the discussion about green finance, especially in like the public arena and the two COPs that have just happened in Colombia and now in Azerbaijan, are about the investments in mitigation and adaptation for climate change, and a lot of like sustainability work for to tackle environmental degradation within the climate crisis. There's been a few good years that everybody was talking about the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market that has posed a lot of problems, and I think we can talk about that later. And something else that has been emerging at the COP in Colombia was the biodiversity offsets market that, again, is raising a lot of flags into how effective that can be. How can we put a price on nature? So I think one of the bigger problems with green finance was that, like monetizing nature and also releasing the really needed help for communities and projects around the world to mitigate and adapt for climate change. I'm not an expert in finance. Like there's a lot of taxonomy, there's a lot of jargon around it. But I think one argument for journalists is that actually countries themselves and even companies themselves have not really defined what is green finance to themselves and what is sustainability. So I don't think there is a convergent definition that helps everybody to be on the same track.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. It's almost like the problem has moved faster and we're just trying to catch up. And because of that, some of these things are still being defined on the go.
And just to add, I think there's not enough regulation that pushes companies. So a lot of it till now has been left kind of to the will of the markets and the, bigger economy and companies' goodwill of doing things, whereas there's not enough regulatory incentivizing companies to actually do something consistent. So when the rules are blurry, you're not in a great spot.
As they often are. Debbie, over to you.
So I'm just back from the climate change COP in Azerbaijan, which is still carrying on until tomorrow, and it's been called the Finance COP. So finance is very much the big thing that's being talked about there. So I think just to take a step back, I think looking at different kinds of climate action, need different kinds of climate finance. So climate action that creates revenue, so the sort of things that Rob was talking about, so mitigation, decarbonisation projects such as solar, wind farms or electric vehicle investment, that creates a revenue stream, and so that lends itself to private finance. And then you've got climate action that creates savings, so adaptation, resilience, improving drainage and sea defences and so on. But with that kind of work, there's often no revenue stream. So you create savings, you prevent losses, but you don't actually create money. So these projects generally need to be publicly financed, not always, but generally. And then there's climate action that is neither create savings or revenues, but just create costs. So I would call that loss and damage. So emergency response costs, rebuilding after disasters, relocation of whole communities due to sea level rise and so on. And this has to be publicly funded. So understanding this difference between public and privately funded is really important. There's a lot of focus on the private sector in climate finance, and certainly at the COP as well, and a lot of pushback from developing countries who find that private finance, the private sector often doesn't really work for them. Their private sector generally can be not very well developed, and as I said, for adaptation and loss and damage, it really isn't the best fit. So yeah, understanding that difference between public and private, I think, is really important.
Right, so I want us to actually now go into whether this is working. So far, what you've seen in your different capacities, the type of investments that are going on, are they actually making a difference? And maybe I'll start with you, Rob.
Well, I mean, I'm probably not the best place to start with that because we tend to do stories about where it's not
working
and hold the banks or the asset managers accountable for using the green finance labels to kind of greenwashing their activities. So maybe not the best place to start with whether or not it's working. I mean, we all want to see it working. Yeah, don't get me wrong.
So what about you, Ken? Coming from also the whole Southeast Asia and Africa perspective, are you seeing this finance actually working?
So the startups that we invest in, the entrepreneurs, they are trying to tackle these problems within their local communities, within the areas that they solve. So like I would say a few investments that I can mention as examples. Like we have a portfolio company in Tunisia called Cebex. They're focused on improving farmer outcomes, so they reduce water usage, reduce fertilizer inputs, and as a result, it leads to higher crop yields, also better soil health. And they do this by leveraging AI. So they use AI data inputs or they have like satellite data imagery put into an AI model, and that gives you very precise agricultural recommendations to say that, okay, given this plot of land, given weather conditions, given historical farming outputs, like you should be putting your seeds in next week and you should be watering it at this frequency. And so being more specific and more tailored leads to better outcomes for the people who manage the land, of course, better yields, more profit, better soil health, better for regenerative agriculture. That's one. Another one that we're working with in Latin America called Satellites on Fire. They use satellite data to identify wildfires in real time rather than 6 to 12 hours later, which is the industry norm. And so they're working across Latin America and they monitor 34 million hectares. And by using advanced satellite imagery and then of course like having their own models behind it where they can go to a much deeper resolution and determine whether there is a fire that's being set up, you can prevent the spread of forest fires at a much quicker rate. And then of course obviously like responding to a smaller fire is easier than responding to something that's already been burning for hours or days or whatever. So it leads to better outcomes.
What I've seen also is when you have people from the community actually implementing these projects, it means so much more than coming in as an outsider and doing it yourself. What about you? Oh, did you have a bit more to add?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that's a really important point. Like all the companies that we invest in, we prioritize local founders, so people who are living these problems, have experienced this firsthand, have deep connections in the communities which they work. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we prioritize female founders as well. So we want to make sure that we have people who are most affected by climate change able to actually generate the solutions and have the support to respond and create the appropriate products behind that.
Would you like to add, Debbie?
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about the work that we do under the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance, which is funded by the ZCRA Foundation. So it's foundation money, which is really flexible and we are working across the board from the kind of community level all the way up to the policy level work. But yeah, just to reinforce your point about working with communities. So I'll just tell you about one program that we're working on in Indonesia where there is coastal flooding. So where they used to be growing tea and mango, now the sea has come in and now the water, their land is flooded and saline. So we're working with them to change their livelihoods in terms of fish farming. So it's the men that typically breed the fish and look after the fish from kind of, the fish fry up to something saleable. And we're helping them with that and to deal with the floodwaters and managing the kind of seawater and the river floodwaters. And then we're also working with the women there to make sure that they also have a livelihood. So supporting them to process the fish, so to cook it, to package it, to send it off to capital. And this is it's a small program, but it's really very successful. And upstream, we're also working with communities there to plant a certain type of plant. It's called Gliricidae, and you plant it on the edge of the riverbank and it stops the erosion, so it stops the sedimentation coming down the river and therefore reduces flooding. But not only does it do that, which is great, but also you can take the leaves of that plant and then you can turn it into fodder for cattle. and then you can sell that if you're the villager. So it's a really nice little commercial system whereby the villagers are incentivized to keep this plant growing because they get benefit out of it because they can sell it and make money out of the fodder, and then it also reduces the flooding downstream. So there's some really great ideas. There are some really good, there's some really great work out there which really can have an impact on communities.
I just want to take this to like a Latin America kind of point of view. Who's leading in this sector as far as green finance projects are concerned? Maybe I'll come to you, Alex, if you have any input.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, there's a big gap in funding in terms of mitigation and adaptation in Latin America, and that's for a whole range of reasons, including the national context of those countries. Because economic growth in the region has slowed down and is quite low, especially after the pandemic. It's still not that attractive for investors. So I think they're mostly supranational, I think they call them supranational international organizations like the GCF, like the Green Climate Fund, the European Investment Bank, and all these international funding bodies that are investing in the region. It's not uniform, the investment, so there are a few countries that take kind of the lion's share of those investments, which I think are Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Costa Rica. And the rest are, of course, it's happening, but not on a bigger scale. And I think that has to do with the governments and also the political context. What Mongabay has been reporting on mostly in terms of finance were inefficiencies in the carbon markets, and how there was like a misunderstood intention of carbon offsets that weren't really addressing the issues on the ground. There's a lot of talk on how ecological restoration through green finance can actually affect communities, because most of the investments done by international organizations, I don't want to generalize, but at least the cases that we focused on offered little involvement to indigenous communities and communities on the ground. So there were not governments and organizations, including the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, were accused of not consulting local populations before coming in with a project. And that created opposition. In Latin America, there are a lot of issues around land rights, because communities don't have formal land rights, which means somebody can come in and they can be displaced, which has happened in several occasions. We had a story about Nicaragua that received a lot of funding through the GCF, which eventually pulled out after proving that project, which was about planting trees, created a lot of violence, because there were already land grabbers there, and them coming in also allowed that situation to escalate. So I think it took local communities about 3 years to prove that they were very affected, which led, I think it was the first time GCF actually pulled out finance from there. And there are a few other cases. It can happen a lot also with like big infrastructure projects, including hydroelectric dams. That actually, you flood the land, you deforest, and communities are forced to move. And it's not necessarily beneficial. There has been a lot of, these projects have happened also by companies to offset their environmental damage elsewhere. So, for example, there's an hydro dam in Colombia, I think the fourth biggest. I don't remember exactly the name. It's in the department of Santander. And the company that built the dam did not consult the population. They figured out that actually the whole process was tainted. And Colombia has legislation that requires big companies to offset their environmental damage. So they started an ecological restoration in a national park, which drove out the local population there. So it's enough to say that these it's called FPIC. I think it's fair, prior, informed consultation with communities has become an essential step. It's an essential step for any company starting a project, but I think also in green finance there needs to be part of the due diligence.
I guess the communities need to feel involved and buy into what's happening as well, and that's what you've brought out. But it sounds like
No, I just wanted to permit me just quickly to jump back to your previous question about, whether green finance is working.
Yeah.
And I think we've heard some great examples about how it can work. But I think we've got to think about what is it working for what, working to achieve what. And this is working towards, transitioning to a greener economy overall, right? And getting to net zero by 2050 if we want to put a kind of concrete target on it. But to do that, there's two sides to that, right? So we need to upscale green finance, and we also need to stop financing fossil fuel expansion. So let's take an overall kind of view of the goal, and I think that's kind of what I'm really saying is that where we sort of come in is to highlight, the companies, the banks that are still financing fossil fuel expansion, even though they've committed to reaching net zero. And we've in a recent investigation, we found that banks with net zero commitments have helped raise $1 trillion of finance for companies expanding fossil fuels since 2021, when the International Energy Agency said there can be no fossil fuel expansion.
So fossil fuel is the investment is still expanding, even
the investment
though,
they're investing in companies that are expanding
Yeah.
fossil fuels. So these aren't necessarily projects; it's corporate finance.
Yeah.
So for the companies, not necessarily for the projects, but that's how they raise the majority of it.
Now, I want to take us into a different space, just talking about these communities. Another idea that comes out of green finance is, can these communities really manage this money? Or are they mismanaging these finances? What have you seen in your reporting, and also with the communities you work with?
Do you want me to start? I think there's, in all the talk around like climate or finance COP, it's like, $1 trillion should go to be committed towards like adaptation to developing economies. I think it's a very, obviously that number makes sense, and like it's science backed in terms of where it comes from, but it does raise to this question, which is like, okay, like let's say that money is there, then like how is it going to be deployed? Like in what way is it going to be deployed? Does it go to governments? And I think the previous panel was talking about like, okay, it's possible that the money gets stuck there, right? It doesn't actually flow down. And so our view of it is that you need a robust private sector. As Debbie was saying, the private sector doesn't really work in a lot of these markets yet. And so if you did have this money, like here, let's say in the UK or the US or wherever, right, you could probably find, 100 companies who could take on $10, $20 million, and then they can make sure that that money's being deployed and innovating new products that will boost people's climate resilience. But if you had that money and you were saying, okay, we're going to do this now in Nigeria, Rwanda, like wherever, right? You don't have that same robust private sector that can actually absorb that capital. You don't have, like, the number of, let's say, startups or organizations that are at a scale that are also climate focused and able to do this, like, it's really just like, there are probably a handful of them. So, like, it's great that money's hopefully going to be raised, but then in order to actually get to a point where it can be deployed efficiently and effectively, you need to be catalyzing an ecosystem of organizations that can actually get to a point where they will one day be able to sustain and absorb that capital, which is a lot of why it's like, okay, it's important to kind of catalyze this startup ecosystem in these markets, right? It takes right now a climate tech founder at least 3 years on average to raise their first round of capital. Whereas for other founders, this is in Africa specifically, but for other industries, it's less than 2 years. And so you need to have more of that capital coming into early stage innovation. So that way you're actually able to accelerate the innovation cycle and make sure that money can come through more efficiently and actually reach people in the last mile, areas where it's harder for institutions or large corporates to actually serve effectively. But sorry, to answer your question around like mismanagement, I think what you were saying around like the voluntary carbon market is like a very perfect example. The carbon market's obviously like taken a beating the last 2 years, and understandably, and it feels like that is, it's just not working. And I think there should be better ideas out there like land banking, which I think could very well replace a carbon market if there was actually any momentum around, having this conversation in a different way. But that's for powers beyond me.
Yeah. Debbie, do you have any thoughts to add?
Well, I actually want to give an example of one of the Multicore Ventures programs, which is about getting money to people directly. So one of the interesting kind of steps forward recently in the sort of humanitarian space is called anticipatory action, where you get money to people just before the disaster hits. It's much more efficient. It allows people to protect themselves and their assets to the disaster, whether that's flooding or whatever it might be. And so Mercy Corps has been experimenting with different ways of trying to kind of stimulate this kind of work. And one of the projects that Mercy Corps Ventures is doing is around using blockchain technology, whereby connecting up people who want to support people in developing countries and providing that money very directly to those affected. So we've been working on this in Kenya, where there's a lot of drought and pastoralists, their cattle dies in the drought. And so when a trigger is hit, then the funding goes directly from kind of where it's held in escrow into people's bank accounts, or they use mobile money in Kenya called, well, you would know, M-Pesa. And it's a really quick way of getting money to where it's needed. So it's much quicker than kind of sort of cash-based systems, and it's much cheaper using blockchain technology. So I think if we can kind of lead into some of these new technologies and get money to really where it's needed immediately, I think that can offer some really good advantages. Mm.
Yeah, actually, thank you for bringing that up. I actually hadn't thought about that. So like Debbie was mentioning, this is a project that we had run through our Crypto for Good fund, and Rob and I were talking like crypto. I assume like when I say crypto, everyone's kind of like, great, right? Like I assume there's not that many like favorable impressions of crypto. Understandably, I know where it's all coming from. It's a very well-earned reputation, but yeah, so we run this thing which is focused on figuring out what are the actual impactful use cases of crypto. And that's within the lens of Mercy Corps. We want to build climate resilience. We want to improve people's livelihoods, their overall well-being. And crypto is a technology platform. It's a technology layer. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. It is mostly used for bad, but that doesn't mean it's exclusively bad. And so one thing that it does really well is move money. It moves money like that, right? And it does it for cheap. If you want to send, so the example that Debbie provided is a pilot that we ran, pastoralists in rural Kenya, if a drought was hit, or if a drought was forecasted, so looking at NDVI data, we could determine in advance whether a drought was going to come. And if that threshold was met, then a smart contract, which is like just fancy code that moves money, a smart contract is triggered, and that money gets sent, that crypto specifically, gets sent from a central wallet to the wallet of our partner in the country. And then that can be, and obviously depending on how you set it up, but then that crypto can either go directly to the individual wallets of the pastoralists who are in this pilot, or then you can exchange it to mobile money and then send it out as mobile money, which is what we did here. But yeah, you end up moving money in seconds rather than, when you send money to Kenya, how long does it take you for that money to get there?
It's quick, it's seconds, and I use it all the time. Yesterday.
Use which?
I use M-Pesa.
Oh yeah, and M-Pesa, yeah, but from like here to the UK.
So from here to the UK, you have to...
here to Kenya, sorry.
You have to use a separate app that then enables the money to get there, but it's really fast.
That's good. Humanitarian organizations often are not that quick.
I think it's just Kenya.
Yeah.
Everywhere else it's...
Yeah. So you can imagine it's like 7 days, right? If you want to get to rural Kenya, because it's like, you got to go through like one bank, it switches with another bank, switches with another bank, goes to, and then you got to go to off-ramp, go to cash, go to mobile money, all that stuff. It's a lot of steps. But with crypto, it's like, boom, boom. And then also done for cheap. So that was what we were doing in this pilot. And it's a way to reduce your costs, better manage funds, and also you have traceability because everything's on chain. So you actually have the way to prove that this money is going from this wallet to that wallet, and it's an automatic ledger kept on chain.
Mm. I want to come to you, Rob and Alex, and specifically talk about reporting about green finance and green finance projects. How do you go about reporting and also investigating whether this is actually working and some of the challenges that people are experiencing? Whichever one of you.
Sure, I don't mind. Yeah, I can go. So how do we go about reporting it? I mean, there's a number of things to consider. One is the evidence that you gather, and another thing is kind of how you tell the story. And like, let's be honest, like who here when they hear the words green finance perks up with excitement and thinks, now that's a story I really want to read. so you have to think about that. But in terms of sort of getting the stories, I mean, fundamentally, you kind of think about it as an accountability story. But I mean, when I'm talking about, I'm talking about the stories, the kind of stories we do, which are largely stories about greenwashing rather than the really positive stuff that's working. But I would say that I see calling out the bad financial products or the financial products that aren't working as part of the solution. You know, we're demanding accountability from the banks that are, you know, investing in marketing these products, and we're demanding accountability from the banks in terms of their net zero and climate commitments. But in terms of kind of how do you get them? I mean, you can start with, given that it's accountability, you can kind of think, okay, well, who is the most responsible for this, for the continued financing of fossil fuels, and then it will take you to the big, US banks and asset managers like JP Morgan and BlackRock, and in the UK we've looked at, we've tried to hold high street banks accountable for their climate promises, because, and this is something that I think responds a bit to the conversation we had earlier, the conversation about your last panel about, there are different types of journalism working in the climate space, and the news journalists, if they get a press release about HSBC's new climate commitment, they're going to write 400 words on it and they're going to move on. They're not going to check back in a year's time and see if they've actually stuck to their climate commitment. That's our job. So with the example of HSBC, they announced at the end of 2022 that they would stop financing new oil and gas projects, which is fine. That accounts for about 4% of their fossil fuel finance. The rest of it is corporate level finance, but nowhere in their policy do they say that they're going to stop corporate level finance for companies expanding fossil fuels. So there's some wiggle room there. So you kind of look through the policies, see what they say and what they say they're going to do, or what they're not going to do. And then you can use resources like, I mean, if you've got access to Bloomberg terminals or LSEG financial market data, you can look at the companies raising money on financial markets. You can see which banks are involved, and you can look at what those banks are doing, the kind of projects that they're supporting. Not everyone is going to have access to those kind of tools. They're expensive, right? And but there are other kind of free to access resources. So you could use the Rainforest Action Network, for example, has its Banking on Climate Chaos annual report and database. So if you're interested in a particular bank or a particular company, that's a searchable database there. BankTrack has a very good database of projects, and you can work backwards from there. They'll tell you who's financing them. But yeah, it's an accountability story. So think about who's accountable and what are they accountable for. If there's a local level extractives project that's causing some kind of harm, maybe start there and work backwards. But there are a number of ways of doing it. The way we try to do it in a slightly kind of in a relatable way is to connect it to your high street bank. So if you bank with Santander or NatWest or HSBC, you might not know that they're helping raise money for BP, which is developing carbon bombs in Azerbaijan, but you might want to know. So that's kind of one way you can do it. Bring it to the high street as well. Yeah,
and I like that you said something in there, making it relatable, which I think is the most important thing. Because as you said, it's not the most interesting thing for people to hear, green finance. But if you can relate it to everyday things and products and services that people use, and I think that makes a difference. Alex, what have you found in your own space as you report about this?
Well, I think the main challenge for reporters starting out reporting on green finance is the jargon around it, and the fact that you need to educate yourself about the basics of it, which allows you to have the critical thinking when you look at all these announcements of investments. I find, these PRE, press releases, announces from companies, ESG commitments, a good source of stories. we never just recount that. It gives us a reason to look in depth at what that means. Also, because if you look in the past, there's a lot of chit-chat about what companies want to do, what governments want to do, and just starting to check exactly what that means, going through the fine print, mapping. I think as a good reporter would do, mapping the actors, mapping the supply chain of that finance, how it gets from that source through which, who is actually on the ground. If I think of Latin America, who is on the ground implementing that project? Because it's not going to be the GCF or it's not going to be some investment fund. It will be either the local government, the national government, some NGO. So it's really good to understand who are those people. And what Mongabay does is a lot of community focus. Like, we report a lot on big problems starting with communities on the ground, a lot of indigenous communities, simply because I already said that there's a lot of human rights and land rights issues there. And whenever you see, big investment announced maybe in an area that is highly conflictual and has all sorts of problems at different levels, then you have to take it with a pinch of salt and start, I think, testing how the reality of it and how realizable it can be. It's already can be a good story. Our team at Mongabay, we have contributors all over the continent. We do a lot of on-the-ground work. We will go and talk to the communities, and we will understand what are the conflicts there, and then start checking with higher and higher levels. So I think that's, that would be my point.
And just briefly coming back to you, Rob, when you're reporting, especially about the private sector, do you receive any challenges or, how do you deal with that? Because, there will be people here who are tempted to go into that space. But I think also investigative journalism is, it can be scary, especially for people who are starting in the industry, and especially when you're talking about green finance and all these banks.
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
I've been doing it for just two and a half years at TBIJ, and you develop a pretty thick skin pretty quickly. But you're absolutely right. You speak to a really important point, which is that banks are very, very sensitive about their net zero commitments. Very, very sensitive about them. They want to be seen to be a green or sustainable bank, and they attract customers and they attract investment with those promises. So when you're calling out discrepancies there, or contradictions, or even breaches of their climate policy, you get very, 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 very defensive. And we've had quite a lot of pretty hard pushback from certain banks that I won't name, and they'll often start with trying to just drown you in technical, very, very technical, complicated methodologies for how they calculate their financed emissions and things like that. So, Jo, our finance reporter, is incredibly literate when it comes to reading all that stuff, and she can cut through it. But you can also tell when they start telling you about how much money is going into solar powers. You kind of know that they don't have a very strong comeback. But they do. We've never, they're sensitive about it. Many of them have built their reputation, banks like HSBC, on being a kind of green bank, a bank that is leading the transition. So you just got to make sure, as with any kind of responsible journalism, make sure that you are getting your facts straight, rigorously checking them, and ensuring that you give the banks a fair right of reply, that you give ample space for your right of replies, allow for some back and forth, because they will come back with some technical information that you have to understand. But then you kind of tend to spot some of the sort of common arguments and pushback, and then you can tell whether or not it's really going to materially affect your output or not.
Now, in a short while, we'll be coming to your questions, so you can start preparing those. But I want to just go back to you, Debbie, and ask, How do you track the flow of this funding? What, for example, do the organizations you work with? How do you do that?
Well, there's a whole machinery actually around tracking public climate finance, and finance that is given by governments like the UK's, money that's given directly, bilaterally, or money that is given to big banks, the World Bank, or the private sector to kind of mobilise. So there's a whole machinery under the OECD DAC that kind of tracks all that money. So it's not something that we do. I think it's highly complex work. But there's a lot of evidence and interest coming out of that. So for example, I've got a couple of facts that I thought might be interesting for the audience. So only 15% of all global climate finance, public, private, for anything, only 15% goes to developing countries. So there's a lot of money out there, but very little of it actually goes to developing countries. 2.6% of that goes to the least developed countries, and it's even more extreme for fragile and conflict-affected countries. So around 1% of adaptation funding goes there. So it's very small amounts of money that goes to the communities that Mercy Corps is interested in supporting. So there's a lot of talk of climate finance, but there are major gaps out there. And another interesting stat, so Africa, despite being home to much of the world's solar resources, has the same amount of installed solar photovoltaics as Belgium, country not known for its solar. And that's because of this big gap between funding, the private sector essentially not wanting to invest in developing countries, perceiving that it's too risky to invest in countries like that. And so this is where we need this kind of public finance piece, needs to be able to pick up where the private sector, private companies are not investing. And again, just something else that you might find interesting if you're trying to do solar photovoltaic. If you're investing in that in Germany, for example, you might want a kind of 7% return on that if you're a private investor. If you're investing in the exact same technology in India, it's more like 17%. In Bolivia, it's 24%, and in Zambia, it's 38%. What that means is the exact same technology, proven, well-proven technology in developing countries just costs a lot more. And so this means that you get less investment from the private sector, or the government of that country ends up paying a lot more in terms of having to kind of stimulate that or give kind of sweeteners or incentives for private sector companies. So again, just to flag that there is a big gap in terms of green money in the global south, and that's something that Mercy Corps is interested in trying to reverse. That's one of the big issues that's being talked about at COP. The agreement will come out in the next couple of days on how much funding is going from developed countries to developing countries. What's needed is about $1 trillion per year. Let's see what the developed countries will agree to.
Right. Now, before we go to the questions, I'd like each one of you to just briefly tell us what you either hope or what you think will happen in this sector. It's rapidly changing, and there's a massive need for more green finance projects and money. But what do you see, based on what the experience you've had in your own respective roles? What do you think will happen in the next few years? I'll start with you. Yes.
Yeah. I don't think technology is a panacea, but just given where I work and the space that I'm in, I obviously see a lot of higher tech solutions. There is a flywheel of data connectivity and analytics that's happening. So there is much more data available, as everyone's aware, but I mean in geospatial data, ground truth data, satellite data, right? We have a lot more of this climate data that is cheaply available, and it's much more accessible, right? Before, you probably have super low res over emerging markets, whereas obviously here you can exactly where your Google Maps is telling you which little nook and cranny to turn in, but you're seeing that change. That's becoming much more abundant and much cheaper. So the data is coming on a lot faster. Connectivity, so obviously mobile penetration has brought a lot more people online, and so you see that that allows people to take advantage of the data that's coming in, and so people can actually access this, so there's much more accessibility as a result. And then lastly is analytics. So obviously with more data, it means you can do more analysis, which means you can produce more useful outputs or tools as a result of this. I mean, AI is obviously the big thing, but like AI is like it's the same old tool. It's much more improved. GPTs allow you to do much more with this data, give you much more useful output, so that you can make more targeted recommendations tailored to local environments. Like I was saying earlier, around like growing specific crops, right seasons, right seeds, right fertilizer amounts, things like that. So this flywheel is going to improve how people respond to climate change. It's going to make us more resilient, and it's going to give people more tools at their disposal so that they can actually, prepare, adapt accordingly to the different impacts of climate change.
Rob.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, with the recent US elections, there's already, there's been such a strong backlash against ESG investing in recent years. Anyway, that's going to face further hurdles. I mean, there are many climate conscious investors out there who want to put money into the transition. So the hope is that they will find ways of doing that. Now, whether they, relabel their funds or call them something else so as not to face, the same kind of pushback, is one question. I think in terms of private finance, what you'd hope to see is, kind of increasing pressure on fossil fuel companies, but not just fossil fuel companies, but other kind of hard to abate, high emitting industries like steel and cement, come under increasing pressure to meet the kind of interim net zero targets that they've set ahead of sort of 2030, because that's something that's often overlooked in climate reporting. People will look at the 2040 or the 2050 net zero target, but we won't look so much at the interim target and what's needed to get there. So hopefully there'll be a bit more kind of pressure on that.
Right. Alex? What I hope to see, at least when I think of Latin America, is that they will be consistent about their intentions for the energy transition, especially the new, more progressive governments of Colombia and Brazil, because they still have a lot of incentive of investing in fossil fuels, and there might be some international pressure on that. So I hope that will happen. I hope to see more investment in like mitigation and adaptation. But I think part of the climate crisis as well is addressing deforestation and biodiversity loss, because Latin America doesn't have a huge contribution to carbon emissions, but it has other systemic problems that, don't keep the carbon in the ground. So there's a massive carbon sink in Latin America that needs to be preserved. So I think a lot of funding needs to go in that direction as well. And the other thing I hope to see, which is constantly discussed at these international conferences, is having local communities and indigenous people more empowered and having more agencies in the projects that affect their lives and come, at grassroots level.
Thank you. Debbie?
So I think in the public finance space, and as I said right at the beginning, in terms of adaptation to climate change, it really needs grant-based funding, which means public finance, really. So in that space, the new big thing is what they call innovative sources of finance. So we all know that countries like the UK don't have a vast amounts of money. We're actually reducing our overseas aid, amounts of money that we send for overseas aid. So, countries, the sort of wealthy, developed countries do not have lots of money to give to developing countries. We know this. And yet there's this massive need for grant-based funding for adaptation and loss and damage in particular. So where will we get this money from? Is it going to come all from UK taxpayers and similar? And I think it's a genuine challenge. But there's this big kind of movement now, as I said, these so-called innovative sources, so making polluters and profiteers pay. So we give lots of subsidies to the fossil fuel companies, for example. Well, maybe we should stop doing that. There are people, we can tax flights, we can tax shipping, we can have a financial transactions tax. There are lots of ways, that more innovative, creative ways, rather than just coming from the kind of, tax revenue, to find these new sources of money, because we really do need to step up climate finance. The IPCC says that we need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. That's 5 or 6 years, depending how you count it. 43% reduction, that is massive. This is a huge challenge. We can't just keep kind of, little bit of evolution. We need a kind of real step change in terms of the finance that's being spent on the climate. So we can't just rely on the private sector doing a bit more and, public aid money doing a little bit more. We really need a big step change. And that's where I think these so-called innovative sources come in. And at the G20, they're also talking about wealth taxes or billionaires taxes. So, there are lots of billionaires in the world now who frankly wouldn't miss the money, but would make a massive difference to humanity if we really managed to crack the climate crisis. So in the next few years, I'd really like to see the momentum on this building up. It's already building up. It was talked about a lot at COP this year. It was kind of a slightly new and weird issue kind of 3 years ago. It was a bit fringe, it was a bit radical, but it's becoming much more mainstream as people realise that we really need to start tapping into finding these new creative sources. So that's what I really like to see in the next few years, momentum on that build up, and then start sort of taxing profiteers and polluters to find this new money to really support the climate action.
Great. I almost feel like with this panel we can do a lot to try and help just the sector as a whole, just based on what you guys have shared. Now, let's go to the questions. I think we'll start with anyone in the room. I know we also have some questions online. Anyone? Oh, we can start online.
Excuse me, sorry.
The question that's come in online is, how do you leverage the overconsumption of energy and water in artificial intelligence to combat systemic injustice?
Wow. Ken, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's a fair concern. I mean, if you look at like Google, Microsoft, they are building vast amounts of data center. They're abandoning a lot of their net zero pledges to say, because they need more power to finance their data centers. They need to buy more GPUs, all this stuff. I don't think there's a very good answer for this yet, frankly. It's probably tied to like what previous panels were talking about, like renewables, right? How do you bring in more renewable energy onto the grid? How do you make sure that there's cleaner sources of energy? We're always going to need more energy, right? Like there is no high income, low energy country in the world. That just doesn't exist. So every single country, if we want countries in the global south to have the same chance at development and prosperity, they need to have access to high energy. And so the only way to do that is to have more clean energy coming on the grid. I think that also addresses this point around clean energy or like more energy consumption from AI.
Mm-hmm. Would anyone else like to? Okay. Any other questions from? No? Yes. No, it's fine.
So sorry. It's so interesting what you're saying all the time I ask a question. But for you, Debbie, you're talking about this money that sometimes is too risky to invest in developing countries. So is it about lack of trust on the communities that will be responsible for implementing these projects? Because what I see is that sometimes, and I'm talking about the Brazilian context, not even because there is a lot of different political / economic contexts in South America. But what we see is that the most part of the time the money goes to the same usual suspects, the same big charities, the same big non-profits. So is it the lack of trust that a community in the Amazonas could be doing the same job? Is it this, or is something bigger than this?
I think what I was talking about before was around private sector finance, and that's why it's more expensive to invest in Brazil than Germany, let's say. And that's really to do with the economy, the perceived risk of investing in developing countries. And there's obviously investors think about risk in all sorts of different ways, and every country and every environment has risk. But yes, there's a perception of increased risk in developing countries, and this is often really due to the kind of policy framework and the regulations and the banking system and so on. So it's not really about the communities, I don't think. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone else wants to take that.
Yeah. So like, if we work backwards on this green finance trend, right? A financier has a risk-adjusted rate of return, right? They have an expectation, a hurdle rate of what they want to clear. So this is like from the perspective of the big banks that you guys look at. Like they say that I want to get a 5% risk-free return, right? Which means I could put that money into the Bank of England's bonds, which is, virtually risk-free, right? I can get a 5% return. But if I take on more risk, then I better have a risk-adjusted return, right? So if I'm going to go to, Venezuela, where, there is political unrest, there's a depreciating currency, it's hard to get money out of the country. All these factors obviously increase your risk. And then rather than 5%, you need to say, I have a 20% hurdle rate to clear in order to make this investment. So then I think to the examples that Debbie was providing, like that's how you get to I think you said 38% in Zambia or whatever it is, right? Because Kwacha keeps on devaluating and getting money out of Zambia is going to be somewhat tricky. But I think if we want to go further back in this, we also have to look at ourselves, right? Because these banks, these pension funds, which control the vast sources of fund, they are stewards of our capital, right? We bank with them. They have a fiduciary duty to us to provide us with returns. So would you, as an individual, say, it's okay, my pension can go down 5% this year. I'm okay with more of that money going to riskier markets and potentially losing it. If we are okay with that as a society, then, sure, that works, right? But I would say, generally speaking, as a society, not even talking about the greed of bankers, right? That's something that's there, and that doesn't probably needs to be unpacked. But are we as a society comfortable with the fact that we talk about promoting investment into these markets, but are we willing to take the risk of that? Are we willing to accept the fact that our portfolios at an individual level can potentially take big hits here? And I'm not sure if when we look in the mirror, are we actually comfortable with that fact? You talk about we should tax polluters more. What that means is that that's just going to cost more for us to buy stuff, right? You're going to see much higher grocery bills. You're going to see much higher energy bills. Are we comfortable with that as a society? Looking at previous elections the past few years, no, we're not. We're not comfortable with inflation. We're really scared of it. So, I don't know. I guess I just don't really have a very clear answer to that either.
I think that was, clear, yeah.
Can I just jump in a little bit on that? Just a couple of things. I think it depends. So you say that you're right that pension funds and so on have a fiduciary responsibility to us to invest appropriately. And that depends on the time frame that you're looking at. If you're looking for, you want decent returns in 5 years, sure. But actually pension funds have to look, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ahead. And if you're looking that far ahead, then actually climate impacts will be really biting at that stage. So I do think there's an issue around, what are we asking our pension funds to what time frame are we working on?
But it's just because, for example, you're talking about the carbon market. I'm sorry. So you're talking about carbon market, and then Mongabay and sorry, I forgot. But that there is a sort of a scan now in the Amazon region with all this carbon market, a lot of startups but funded by ex-Google, ex-Nubank, all this big tech. They are going to the Amazon. They are promising a lot of carbon, blah, blah, blah. And they are asking indigenous and traditional communities to sign papers that they have no idea. And then they just say, okay, so there is a lot of traditional communities now that they agree to help you with the carbon. And in fact, it is a big thing now in Brazil because a lot of people, now this is a situation that's now in the court, everyone is investigated. So I don't think that it's too risky. I think sometimes people just don't trust that the people on the ground, the local communities can do this because they are giving money to people in São Paulo, for example, to do this startups and go to the Amazon and then implement these beauty companies, using the money from Acai and send superfood to the rest of the world. So it's a follow the money. Where is the money is being invested?
Do you want to?
I think there's also besides the cultural clash that might happen when investing in in indigenous territory, because I don't think people are really equipped in going and speaking with indigenous people also respectfully and in their language. There's also a language barrier. I think there's also this rural-urban divide, that it's much easier to invest in an urban environment. And when I said earlier that Latin America is not that attractive for investors, is exactly because of the political volatility, or the fact that, you know, all these, even in Brazil or in Colombia or in Peru, all these amendments in laws are passed every week with little impunity, that investors are not sure about which legislation will impact them when. So I think, at least from our reporting, there's not a sense that an indigenous community or a local community cannot invest or do the work on the ground, because they actually hold the knowledge on how to improve their environment. Is that the external people, the external actors don't know how to deal with that, and they're also very risk averse. And I think also the land conflicts that are abound in Latin America are a factor as well, because if you don't have a formal document on whose land it is, you will have a lot of opposition, and maybe that's one thing that they avoid. And there's been, speaking of the carbon offsets, Mongabay covered last year, we did a big investigation in Peru, and there were some companies pretending to sell, you know, carbon credits and pretending to be affiliated with the UN and actually putting their logos all on their websites, and they sold this to, they tricked a lot of communities in Peru, in the Amazonian Peru, to sign. And yeah, based on that investigation, actually the UN reacted and, you know, rejected completely that initiative. But it's very hard to understand how the damage can be undone. And also those communities lose trust in any external entity coming and promising them things. So.
Can I just add one really small thing? And I think this is a more banal reason. I think is that investors often want to shift a lot of money in a big program. And so if you're talking about a small program, you know, adaptation needs to be locally led. As you said, it needs to really come from the community. The community need to understand what it is. It's going to be a relatively small amount of money. And so the admin costs for a pension fund would be impossible. So this is a really frustrating kind of thing. This feels like something that could be tackled to kind of have, you know, a big amount of money from an investment pension fund or wherever, and then broken up into much, much smaller grants, which could then be delivered in a respectful, community-driven, bottom-up kind of way. I think that needs to be, I think there are some schemes like that, but we need to have more of that, I think.
Yeah. Unless there's another question? Okay, yeah. So I think it's okay to...
If there's another question, we can take it, otherwise we can't.
Yeah. Okay? Okay, let's finish. I just want to thank you all. I think we can give them a round of applause. Thank you all. And if you do have any other questions, I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to speak to them individually. And thank you all for participating in the session. And there's clearly an opportunity or a need to report more about what's happening in this space. So I guess it's a challenge to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Myra.